encourage you to put any questions you might have along the way in the chat. I know we're virtual, so this isn't exactly a casual open forum where we're all hanging out, just chatting informally like I would like, but I want to try to make sure that this has the same, as much as possible, richness and conversationality that we would like it to have, and it's not just another slide deck bullet point death by a PowerPoint presentation. So with that, I would like to introduce myself, and then I'll hand off to my partner Stan to introduce himself. My name is Genevieve LeMarchal. I am a partner at Aventurine. Aventurine is a different type of fund. We'll loosely call it venture capital because there is capital and we like new ventures. But as you're about ready to learn, that that the process of bringing what I like to call, for lack of a better term, deep technology or new science to market through the path to commercialization is completely different from anything that you might see on Shark Tank. It's completely different from any sort of enterprise SaaS or consumer product. And entrepreneurs or aspiring entrepreneurs or researchers and inventors who have something that is extremely valuable that the world really needs and that can benefit many different types of industries or applications are oftentimes not served. In fact, they're hamstrung by the process of startups because this isn't the way that science works. So I'd like to make sure we have a chance to fully discuss that, and then we'll talk a little bit about the quantum landscape, what we are seeing, the types of deals that we are seeing very loosely, and what's going on in the world of funding, and what the world that we are expecting to look like here in the near future will be like. Is that everything, Stan? It's framed up pretty well?
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, cool, perfect. So, just real quick, myself, I'm Genevieve LeMarchal. I have been, for most of my career, an entrepreneur, a serial entrepreneur. I do not have a science background. I have a long, storied, to me, I guess, background in startups. And I've been working with anything from, science and technology startups, although I don't have a science background, to consumer technology and consumer products. And that's how I can really speak to what the process to bring a scientific-based innovation to market is completely different. I didn't start actually in the world of venture capital until about 5 years ago. So I'm pretty new in venture. I've had some experience with a couple fund formations, as well as a nonprofit that was a loan fund focused on funding high-performing women-led companies. So I really like to work with women in STEM, and guys are great too, but we really need to represent women here. So that's something that I'm really passionate about. And here at Aventurine, I like to focus specifically on getting companies to capital readiness and getting researchers, scientists, and inventors to the point where we have a very, very compelling investment opportunity that is something that's relatively easy. I'll never say getting funded is easy, but the path to funding becomes clear, and that's where we work. So, Stan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. So I am a former academic and researcher. I undergraduate degrees in electrical engineering, computer science, and applied math, PhD computer science. I was an academician for quite a while. 2 different tours, one at Rice University, one at Baylor College of Medicine. And I also wound up moving. I'm the oddball. I'm the guy that didn't want to be a researcher. I wanted to build cool stuff, not just write papers. So I transitioned into commercial science in the mid 80s. I ran R&D for an R&D section for Shell, and then did a lot of consulting work for most of the, people that were building high performance computing systems, which at that point in time were oil companies and security agencies and medical and nuclear explosion simulations. So all the guys that were buying supercomputers. I've done 14 startups. I've had 8 exits, 5 IPOs. My most of those have been technology based. I was very active in the early days of creation of the internet. I was on the NCP to TCP/IP transition team, and then 2 years later, I co-wrote the code to open the ARPANET to non-DARPA funded institutions. And then 3 years after that, I was on the National Science Foundation Task Force for commercialization of the internet. So that was a first third of my career, building big internet companies. After I moved to Oregon to do yet one more big internet company, in the giant, what we call the Great Telecom Winter of 2000, I moved over to private equity, working for professional investors that were basically buying telecom, internet, and software assets and that had fallen over, and trying to stand them back up and turning them into operating companies. I did that for about 17 years. And in the course of that, I was also involved pretty heavily in venture investing. And so I've been on both sides of the table pretty extensively. David Van Wee, who's the primary founder at Aventurine, and I have bumped into each other a number of times over the years and started collaborating about 4 years ago around the idea originally of creating a venture capital fund that made it easier for science-based startups to raise money. And in the course of understanding what made it not possible for them to raise money currently, realized that we needed a completely different structure that eventually led to creating Aventurine. But we're very deeply committed to science-based startups and to the facilitating the commercialization of new technology that's developed that just falls on the floor. Right? So we're here to help with that. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Jen, and we can kick this thing off.
Great. So one of the things I want to start off with everyone here is framing out a lot of the lies that we believe that startups in general are told, but in this particular instance, we're talking about science-based startups and new technology startups. And oftentimes we see people like you really lumped in with some of those other startups, what Stan likes to jokingly call the Flappy Bird of the world. And what you're doing is completely different than that. So the first lie that startups are often told is that putting together a team is going to be easy. Building traction is going to be, relatively straightforward and key. What was that?
Hey, Jen, you want to start? You want to share your slides? Want to share your screen?
Am I not? I'm so sorry, you guys. Oops. My mistake. There they are. And then one of the key points that I want to make for everyone and make sure we have time to really delve into this, because it's extremely, extremely important, is the difference between or the delineation and the understanding between patents versus publications, how those two things flow and don't flow and how they're interconnected, and what is important in terms of an approach to this very, very early on if you are considering anything that has potential commercialization pathways. And the last lie is that it will be easy to raise money. That raising money is sort of like an afterthought. It's not going to be anything. And, that maybe even once you raise money, like it's going to be all over, it's going to be done. So those are a couple of things that we want to start with. And then if there's any other questions or anything like that you guys would like to chime in on, I want to make sure that we have a chance to address that. So let's just kind of dive into the first one here, putting together a team. We often hear a lot of startup founders, and this is particularly true with the types of companies that you guys are considering creating intellectual property for or helping to start, is that it will be relatively easy to recruit a team. Maybe you can think of a few people off the top of your head that may or may not be qualified with the right skill sets that you think you may need. Oftentimes, the team ends up being a very, very weak element in the company, or it's something where when you're starting to think about a team and bringing people together, it shouldn't be 1 + 1 = 2. It needs to be 1 + 1 = 5, or even 1+1 = 11. And so if the team dynamics and the team chemistry and just that kind of special something that they have, that they can bring together doesn't have that, then you don't have a strong enough team likely to even make it to a seed round. And that is something that is oftentimes not necessarily the fault of the founder. It's the fault of the fact that advisors who are advising along the constructs of the lean startup, or how other startups might come to market, is that believing that you have to be the CEO or the CTO of that company. And in many cases, you may not want to be the CEO, nor in many cases should you. And we'll be diving much more into that. But one of the things we do at Aventurine is we make it very economically beneficial for the inventor, regardless of whether they're the CEO or not. So they're not really leaving anything on. They're not getting the short end of the stick in any way for not just because they're not the CEO. Another thing that we hear often with many startups, but particularly with science and technology, is the business side people can just really be hired. That there's a relatively cookie cutter type of formula for that, and that you can just kind of talk to them about your vision and they'll understand and they'll be able to run with it. The reason that is not the case, there's many reasons, but one of them is it's extremely important early on that the early strategy roll up into your future acquisition or your future prospects for liquidity. And so if you just hire the business side people to kind of do business stuff and it's sort of cookie cutter, punch it out, you're likely going to end up with a company that maybe you can't get funded. Or what we often see, and this is very common and very sad, is companies that go 7-10 years down the road and they've stalled out and they've never quite gained the traction. And it's because the business side wasn't able to execute. And so that's another one. And then another one is just that your technology is extremely solid. It's very valuable. And it has such strong market applications that people are definitely going to want to buy it, and you're not necessarily going to have the sales. And I think that we've seen some software companies, especially in relatively recent history, do a disservice to all startups by, in some cases, being able to successfully adopt this model. One of those companies is the company that created Jira and Confluence, Atlassian. They're sort of anti-sales people. But really, they still are selling. They're just selling in a different way. And their technology is widely adopted, but they are still utilizing sales. But their drumbeat about how sales is so bad, and if your technology is great, people will use it, is actually hurting technology and science, I believe, more so than it's helping.
So as another point on this, we also see the same thing on the other side, like people that are business professionals that have an idea for something but don't have any idea how to get it built. So this is not just something that's unique to the scientist that's trying to believe that they can just hire the business side done. There are a lot of people that believe, well, I've got this brilliant idea, but I just have no idea how to build it, so I'll put up a bid on Fiverr and get some guy to write me the code for $10 because how hard could it be? The reality is that really, really smart people have a common cognitive distortion, which is because some things are easy for them, they believe other things ought to be equally easy. And the reality is that those skill sets are orthogonal, and that you don't, because you're really good at one thing doesn't necessarily mean that you've got necessarily any ability at all at something else.
Mm-hmm. And we see that all the time, because we work with people who are absolutely brilliant, but that doesn't necessarily mean your startup doesn't stall out at year 5 and go nowhere from there, and now it's year 10 and your company is basically unfundable. There's nothing that can be done, and the only thing oftentimes that will get a company going at that point is sales. And that's sometimes a difficult pill to swallow. And it's gonna, and then at that point too, oftentimes it requires some heavy lifting and some some capital infusions in order to build out some of the channels that weren't built before properly. And that means that the founders have to give up much more equity than they otherwise might had they just been a little bit more prudent and diligent about this early on. Okay, so with that, we're going to get a little bit more into funding stuff. But I'd like to talk about how to think about this process if you can't rely on the lies that you're being told. Which the way that I'd like to present this to you is that is through what NASA uses, which is the technology readiness scale. And this is how we at Aventurine also look at technology and sort of use it to guide our thinking and how to plot the pathway to market for some of the research and people that we're working with. So the technology readiness scale is basically, you can also see the continuum along the top of the funding sources. Past venture capital, there's more funding sources there, but this is just the early, kind of the first couple steps. But basically, you know, we have at Aventurine gotten involved with companies that were at stages 1 and 2, which was basically a research paper and maybe some initial studies done, but no proof of concept quite yet for how that study would be applied to commercialization pathways. So in order to do that work, you know, that's quite a lot for us to partner really closely with the inventors and the researchers to carry out their vision into commercialization and to work with them to see that through. Companies that are at proof of concept or sort of validation stage have done some initial research, and they've got something there that shows that the commercial applicability of what they created and invented is possible. It doesn't mean people will want it, and it doesn't mean it will work. It just means it's possible.
It also doesn't mean that you can make a bunch of them. Like in my particular discipline, you know, building multiprocessor computer systems, building one is easy. Being able to build, you know, 10,000 is like harder, and being able to build 10 million is like, oh God. So you have this continuum here across that, and as researchers, academic researchers in particular, the grants that you're typically looking at being sourced from the federal agencies and a lot of the larger private grantors are basic science stuff. It's questions like, is this thing possible? You know, and a lot of times the research orientation will be around discovering new things that are not previously known, as opposed to practical applications of things which are well known. And that takes you through that 1, 2, 3 kind of stage on the scale. Maybe a little bit into 4 if you've got a more aggressive build team that are like, let's see if we can actually do something. But the problem with that, though, is that in the 1960s through the early 1990s, that was enough to actually get you venture capital funding. Things have changed, and now you've got to basically be at the far end of the scale, where your idea has transformed into a product that that's in the market and that people are giving you cash money for. And that's the traction thing that we were talking about here. The challenge is bridging that gap. And there's plenty of grant money. There's a lot of SBIR and STTR grant money that's available down in the 1, 2, 3, 4. There's a lot of basic science grant money that's in 1, 2. The challenge is going into the 5, 6, 7 to get to the point that you can actually turn this into a commercial product.
So I want to speak a little bit to the 5, 6, 7 part. So Stan spoke about the STTR grants and the SBIR and some of the other, we see sometimes things through the DoD and stuff like that. These grants can be, of course, written in such a way that if you have some advising on how to write that grant, it can, because from someone who understands what this path is going to be like, they can help get you as far through the 5, 6, 7 point, because that's the readiness gap. And Oftentimes researchers, they know how to write the grant, but they're not necessarily understanding what it is that they need to get them through that gap. And so they aren't able to use their grant funding for the things that they need to actually propel them along the way to commercialization. So that's something too, if you are believe that you're working on something that's highly commercializable and you would like, you're in the process of grants, we're oftentimes really happy to help you just sort of understand what you may be, what's ahead for you, so that you can prepare yourself now to ensure that you've got some funding to try to get you as far along. You're not going to get all the way through the readiness gap on just grants, but hopefully you can get some of the way through there. The readiness gap also, that's the point where oftentimes we see founders, researchers, and inventors, I guess I would say, believing that they'll be receiving angel capital. And while that's not totally out of the question, while you're in the readiness gap, there's quite a substantial amount of de-risking that needs to be done in order for you to be able to be fundable to an angel. And you're definitely not fundable to a venture fund. So the readiness gap is oftentimes where we like to start working with companies as well, because that's, yeah.
So let's talk about that, the reason for that funding thing just a little bit. The venture capitalists are not in business to make your life easier. They're in business to make money, a lot of money. And their investors, their limited partners that give them the money that they invest, have an expectation about how much money they're going to get back and about how long it's going to take for that to happen. So the problem is that as the industry matured, the investment industry matured, the expectation around the size of the returns got bigger, and the amount of time that it would take to get that return got smaller. So if I've actually got a new product that I'm going to sell to people, and I can make this in some kind of quantity, and I've already got it into the market, it's probably going to take me 3 to 5 years to get sufficient volume in the market and uptake and people loving it enough that I can have a venture exit. And that's fine, because most of the investors are insisting that they get that return within 7 years. The problem is, if I've just got an idea, or maybe I've got a working prototype that's kind of breadboarded together, I can count on another 3 to 5 years to get me to the point that I've got that first product. That's then going to take me 3 to 5 years to exit. And that, what we call that the hold time, the amount of time from when you write the first check until the time that the venture exits, is long enough that most of the, well, none actually of the institutional venture capitalists write checks, because they have to have that 7-year maximum kind of hold time on things. So we're working to figure out how to get more money. We've devised a way to get more money into the earlier side of things.
Yeah. I see some questions in here, a couple good ones from Gustavo. But I think we should address that some of these specific ones. These seem like a little bit informational, so we'll get to those, I think.
Yeah, we'll get to that one. That is a good question.
Yeah, it's a good one. True, hard. We have answers, but maybe you won't like them. I don't know. Anyway, but the yeah, and so the actually, I think we're good. We've started talking through this. So so that's the difficulty, that we touched on a little bit, is venture capitalists aren't necessarily going to be interested in your in talking to you until you've gotten to these 8 and 9 stages. And so they may want to hear about what you're doing, but there's a big difference between a VC being interested in connecting with you and wanting to hear about what you're doing and staying in touch versus you're an active pipeline. So if you're identifying with any of these other stages, you're not an active pipeline for a VC, and you're likely in the readiness gap phase. And so stop trying to raise VC funds and wasting your time. So let's go ahead and talk about patents versus publications. This is a really, really important topic. So important. There are many many people that we work with that we are unable to help them commercialize our technology. And in fact, nobody is able to help them commercialize our technology because of this issue. And it's something that is a mistake that's made extremely innocently. And it's kind of sad. So, there's two delineations, and I think it's helpful, and I'll have Stan go into this a little bit more, but if you're going to publish and you have commercialization potential, you should get advising from an IP strategist, not necessarily an IP lawyer. Take it away, Stan.
Yeah. So it's always interesting. This is a great place to notice the great disparity between commercial and academic research. In academia, don't be alarmed by what I'm about to tell you, but papers, publications, and poster sessions are your sales and marketing channel, because basically you're trying to persuade people that you're doing good work so that they'll give you more grants. So congratulations, you are in sales. You just didn't realize it. However, the problem is that if you're going to try to patent something, then what the requirement is that this be novel and that there not be prior art that says that this is something that has previously been done. And the bar on that is pretty high, in that if it's ever been published, then it can considered prior art. And published can be on anything from an internal message board to Nature, right? They don't really care, as long as there's a way that somebody else could previously have seen this prior to the patent being filed, that counts as prior art. So the problem is that this runs that way relative to what you're used to in academia. When I was running our computer science R&D for Shell, my number one problem is that I thought my problem was going to be finding researchers that were interested in working on the problems that I was trying to solve. The problem was actually that I had guys that had 10 years of experience writing papers that were coming in and being told, you will never publish another paper again as long as you live, because they just couldn't get their head wrapped around that. So in this particular case, that's important. It's important as a researcher to publish, but it's also important for you to keep in mind that if you've really come up with something novel, that you want to make sure that you've figured out how to file patent disclosures and preliminary patents before you actually publish. Because if you don't, the economic value evaporates. Let's talk about patents just for a second here. A patent is a grant by the government for a monopoly on the practice of a new teaching for 20 years from the date that you file. Patents are phenomenally important. Patents are wired into the body of the Constitution. Freedom of speech is an amendment. Freedom of religion is an amendment. Patents are in the body of the Constitution. It's a big deal, right? The notion that you should be compensated for adding to the body of knowledge is been around since the Venice in the 1300s, and it's something that people don't think about appropriately when they're doing things. And part of that is that most of our thought processes around this have been based on the economics of the stock market as opposed to the economics of product and sales. So it's important to understand that you want to make sure that you're thinking about this stuff appropriately. The other thing that goes with this, and I don't think it's not on this page. We'll talk about that on another page, but it's super important to understand that actually it's the next page, which you could go to right now, Jen.
Okay, sorry.
Right, so it's important that you understand how patents and trade secrets work, and they're different. And you also need to understand that if you're in an academic institution, the Bayh-Dole bill, which is the law of the land, sets the framework for how things work, but there are going to be specific institutional and grantor organization overhang about restrictions and covenants on how your intellectual property is managed. And you probably have an IP and tech transfer department in the university, which may or may not be useful. I can't really say more without offending people that practice that stuff. Um, but the other thing on that is that even if they're competent, or even if you engage outside counsel, that one of the things that you have to think about is the difference between building a toll gate and building a fence, right? So the operant model that most patent attorneys have is, I've got a sandbox and I want to build a fence to keep people out of my sandbox. And from our side, commercializing intellectual property, we like to think about this like, no, 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 I want to build a toll gate so that people can get into my sandbox and pay me for having done that, which is not the way most patents are written. Let's see, yes, so Tom, your thing is exactly right. The university will have rights. The extent of those rights may also be changed by who the organization that funded the grant funding may put additional restrictions on that. There are some private funds that have even more restrictions than the federal funds, and all of the federal funds, go into this. Now, and so as the university does have rights, that doesn't mean that you can't get access to those rights. We routinely negotiate those sorts of deals for very favorable terms. The university really isn't in the business of commercializing intellectual property. They really don't understand how to do this. And it's a little bit scary because there's the potential for someone to have to write a really big check to make this stuff happen. So if they can get anything that looks like a positive return on it over time, that adds just a little bit of shine to the reputation of the university, that they're happy about it.
Yeah, they want you to commercialize it because then they get to parade you around in front of their alumni.
Right.
Talk about how great they are and
Yep.
ask for more money for their friends. So,
yeah. All right. But it's important to think about that stuff as you go, because it's easy to get wrapped up in the fact that, as I said, in academia, publications are the currency, and think, oh, I'll write this paper, it'll be great, without thinking about the fact that you may just cut yourself out of 20 years of royalties. So.
Yeah. I think one of the things too that oftentimes comes up along that, and we'll go as we transition into the topic of fundraising, is that most startups fail. They just do. And that is a fact of life. And it really sucks, especially from entrepreneurs here telling you this. We have had our fair share of painful failures. And we will not talk about that today. This would need to be a happy hour for us to have those conversations. But I think that one of the things, as the researcher or the creator of your intellectual property or your trade secret, if you think about it that way, and if you set yourself up properly early on from the beginning, your startup can fail, but you can ultimately be successful financially and through licensing agreements and things like that with your invention. So really what we're trying to do is say, yes, we want startups to be successful. Yes, we want these companies to grow. Yes, we want that ultimate exit at the end. Of course, we want that. But ultimately, what we're most interested in is commercializing intellectual property that can change the world in the most profound, positive, and impactful ways. And so your IP cannot do that if it's encumbered in a company that's filing bankruptcy. And that's something we're very acutely aware of. And we want to set the people who work with us up for success in that way.
Right. So we engage in some business practices, which are, as a friend of mine likes to describe them, well known by those that know, but not terrifically common. And to that end, with companies we work with, we work very hard to educate them on that and make sure that they have a good outcome for the long term, that the inventors have a good outcome for the long term.
Yep, exactly. And that's kind of the point that Stan just made in the comment, another Stan, not you, Stan, is that patent attorneys oftentimes aren't trained to be able to take this lens and this approach when they are setting up the patent portfolios for their clients. And so they're building the fence, not the toll booth. And sometimes the fence is in sometimes the fence is a bad fence, I guess. I don't know. I was trying to make an analogy and it didn't work. So it's your patent attorney has been trained to analyze prior art and to write patents, but not to do patent strategy. And that's something that we could have a whole other you know, we could do a week long
Yeah.
seminar about that.
Yeah. That exceeds scope. So,
Yes, we will not be discussing that today. We'll be here all night. Anyway, so let's talk about raising money. One of my favorite topics, and specifically about the lies that we're told about raising money. The first one is that it's going to be easy to raise money because quantum is really hot. It's not easy to raise money for anything unless you're George Clooney, and he probably raised his own money for that tequila brand or whatever he started. There is tons of money looking for good deals. While there is money out there, and that's something I want to say, especially, you know, during COVID, the climate, the appetite, and the interests, and how people would like to deploy that capital and what they would like to consider, or changes with the wind, changes with economic climates, and there is a lot of considerations in quantum that are cons to the types of investors that have a lot of money, that that weigh and balance out the pros. So that is something that I would like to open that up for a discussion, and Stan will elaborate there a little bit too. And also, you know, the thing is, like, you're doing something really unique. There's literally no one else out there who's done what you're doing. And so, you know, people will have really no choice but to invest in your company. That's really an execution thing, ultimately, even if you have properly done the intellectual property, which most people have not. That still comes down to that still comes down to your execution. We'll discuss that a little bit. And then the facts is it always comes back to that, you know, technology readiness level. And, you know, any VC, if you tell them about TLRs, they're not going to know what it is. So this is just for your own reference for yourself. But if you're too far down the scale, it doesn't matter what kind of company you have, and it doesn't matter how dialed you are. It's just going to be hard. It's going to be hard. And there's really no way around that unless you're starting the company with co-founders who have deep pockets and they're going to fund it. That's really, you know.
It all gets back to, as we said the whole time, you know, if when you're talking to the VC guys, the part of the pitch is that, you know, they have to believe that you're going to be worth $1 billion, and that is actually the number. And they also have to believe that you're going to get there in years. And absent that, they just don't. You don't look attractive enough. Now, there are people that are niche focused and whatnot. There are exceptions, but broadly, if you're talking to institutional investors, that's the stuff. But let's talk about, and the other thing is that there are a lot of quantum investments that aren't actually quantum. We actually get in and rip stuff apart. Like, I had a deal that crossed my table not too long ago that was a quantum encryption thing, that when you actually got into it, it was standard elliptical curve that was quantum resistant. But they'd stuck quantum on the side of it because, you know, quantum is hot, and then we can raise money. So when you see a lot of people talking about things like that, you have to be careful, because quantum is actual quantum is actually hard, and it's also beyond the understanding of most of the. There aren't a lot of guys like me out there that like actually understand the stuff they're writing checks. Let's put it like that. And it's easy to bamboozle the unwary by sticking quantum on the side of it. Hey, Jen, let's go to the next slide. So let's talk about what quantum investments actually look like.
Okay.
So this is a scatter plot from PitchBook. And I pulled all the deals that we actually had that had quantum in them that I sorted through as not being not quantum, out of which there was a pile. And these are just venture capital deals. These are not private deals or acquisitions or mergers or any of those things. And this is showing basically what we're seeing. Now, since 2015, there's been just a little under 700 million that's invested. That's in comparison to like almost 2 billion in blockchain, right? Okay, or 100 billion in SaaS. So the size of the investments in the market have been fairly small, right? And now look at the bubble size, and you can see close to the bottom of the line a lot of really small stuff, and a little bit further up some slightly larger stuff, and then we've got this one oh my God, where did that come from? That's a super late stage investment. Those guys have already, that's like a Series D investment. They've raised a lot in the past. But the median size is 3.3 million, which is not terribly big. And if that's median, that should tell you that there are a whole bunch of deals that are also smaller than that. And as you can tell just by looking at the scatter plot, not a lot that are a huge amount bigger. So the amount of money that's available out there is fractional to that which is going into other spaces. And part of the reason for that is that at this point in time, we don't actually know what the utility on some of this stuff is. But so as theoreticians and as practitioners and as people that are interested in the space, we can theorize about all sorts of things that you can do with this or that, or if once we get to the point that we can X, then we can Y, and all the things that go into that, none of which has any directly actionable commercial validity from the perspective of the investors. So they're being kind of cautious at this point. So yes, it's a hot space. People are talking about it, but no, it's not a hot space in terms of there's billions of dollars going into it.
People like to talk about it. Could you comment either now or later on the delineation between VC versus PE? Because I think sometimes we hear about some of the PE deals in the news, and those are not VC deals, and corporate investment as well.
Sure. So, and I've worn all three hats. So this would be good. When most people say VC, they mean institutional venture capital investors, which means a fund that is formed with investor money that makes investments. They don't make they buy a portion of a company for a price against the assumption that at some future date that company will sell for a higher price, and they will make a type of gain called capital gains, because I paid this much and I got that much when it sold. The asset appreciated, right? And so they're only interested in capital gains. So they're interested in buying a certain amount of the company now, and then at some future date the company sells for more than that, and they take the difference as profit. The firm gets basically 20% of that, and they give the rest of it to the investors, and everybody goes away happy. Corporate venture capital, which also is corporate strategic investors, operates a little differently. They still are looking for that type of return. They want the investment. They will buy today at this price, and they want it tomorrow to be at that price. But the reason for the investment is not because the investor, the guy running the venture group and the corporation, thought it was a great idea. The reason for the investment is some senior vice president has a hole in his product line, and he knows in 5 years, 3 years, he's going to need this thing that doesn't exist. And if we invest in these guys today, they may be that, so that I can acquire them and plug them into my product line. So it's an outsourced development activity as opposed to a pure financial investment. And that's cool, that's awesome, because these guys will write big checks and take big bets. The downside is that if that executive leaves that position and somebody else replaces them, or that whole division evaporates for some reason, then you lose the support of that company as an investor, because it's no longer aligned with their actual commercial interests, even though the investment may actually still be a really, really good investment. PE, private equity, basically are people that are investing for cash flow. So when I was running a private equity group, the objective that we had was we were looking for companies that threw off cash, so that I was on average receiving 20% value of what I'd put in on an annual basis. So I'd make $100 million investment. I'm looking for 20 million in cash flow back to me. That's back to me. That's not net to the company. And that leads to a completely different kind of investment, because these guys are interested in things that are actually being sold, and they don't care if it's going to be more valuable tomorrow than it was today. And as you can witness by some of the really catastrophic things that have happened in the market, the Toys R Us is a great example, right? They don't exist anymore because they had a bad private equity investor that pulled all the cash out, which was a great return for the PE firm, but the value of the company decreased over time and eventually went out of business, right? So it's a completely different way of thinking. I'll disclaim that we didn't do that. We actually created value as opposed to extracted value, but the cash extraction is the way that those guys think about it. So when you talk about different people in different stages in the market, it's important to know that some investors are looking for cash on cash. Some investors are looking for capital gains, and the amount of time that they're willing to hold the investment before it starts generating the kind of return they're looking for varies, again, depending on a lot of things.
Right. Okay.
Great. So let's talk about patents in this space. So we subscribe to a couple of services, and I pulled this together. Since 2012, actually, it's as far back as we found quantum patents. There have been almost 130,000 patents filed globally, and that includes multi-country filing. So if I've got a patent in the U.S. that I refile the same patent in the EU and APAC and whatever, wherever, that shows up. Each of those filings shows up in that number. It doesn't show up as a separate patent. You drill into it a little closer. It's almost 20,000 filed in the U.S. Only 6,500 filed in the EU. Almost 40,000 filed in APAC minus China, and 50,000 filed in China alone. That's the growth rate in China is just astronomical, and 2,700 filed in the rest of the world combined. We're seeing annualized growth rate at 100% year on year. It's also interesting to note that in the U.S., 87% of the related patent applications in quantum were approved. That the application turns into a patent, and that's roughly 2x what we see in a lot of other fields of endeavor, which is
not a good thing.
Tells me two things. It tells me one is that there's a whole bunch of new discovery that's being created, so that there's not a lot of prior art and not a lot of collisions with prior issued patents. And the second thing that is a little scary is that maybe the examiners are not very good.
And
we worry about
just
a lot.
because you've been issued a patent, and we see this a lot, like every day almost, just because you have a patent that's been issued, it does not mean that your patent can be litigated or defended. And what that means is your patent not only does it mean that you have a fence, just because a real fence, just because you have a patent, but it also means that you might not be able to make any money. Because if you can't litigate or defend your patent, you can't license your patent. So what is scary, and not scary, but it's a big consideration when we see so much in a new field like quantum and having so many patents being issued, is that I believe that the prior art may not be substantial enough to be able to be defended, and that the inventors might not have their patents might be too Swiss cheesy, holy. And so if that is the case, then they're really shooting themselves in the foot. And I think when we see rates like this, that's oftentimes the case, and that's where a patent portfolio strategy that's done properly could help make it so that your patent is one of the ones that does stand up to litigation and is defendable.
Yeah, the Swiss cheese holes are so the Flappy Bird can fly through them.
Yeah, so the Flappy Bird.
No, but seriously, one of the other things that's important in this education about what patents do for you is a patent is best thought of as a license to litigate, because it's not a guarantee that somebody will actually pay you. It's a requirement that if you take them to court and prove that they infringed, that they have to pay you, right? So, and there's a whole side industry on patent enforcement. I'm running a multi-billion-dollar enforcement campaign for a client right now, where they were infringed heavily by some of the biggest names in the industry because they figured that a couple of guys in a garage were not ever going to come after them. Well, it turns out there's a multi-billion-dollar industry of people that write checks just to go do that. So being plugged into that network is super important as part of the thought process on this too. But what else do we have, Jen?
In terms of the patents. Oh, okay.
There we go. Yeah. So this is my favorite piece here. The big lie in quantum in particular is that in the future, quantum will let us, and then it's like, oh my God, people make up stuff like out of the whole cloth about because they don't understand. They do not understand. They don't understand entanglement. They don't understand, quantum probability theory. They don't. I mean, if you're not a practitioner, you don't understand, and you make shit up. And it's quantum. Quantum has been in popular fiction for a really long time, so there's a lot of misunderstanding about what it means. And the thing that I want to come back to on that is that you can't know. No one knows. We're so barely dipping our toes into this that that we don't understand yet where the impact is going to be. And I don't want to encourage all of you that no matter how crazy the thing you're thinking about sounds, it might be right? I mean, I just did a big piece on the evolution of computer memory from mercury to ley lines to semiconductor for a blog that I support. And the thing that's fascinating to me is that from the 1940s through until now, the evolution of von Neumann architecture, Boolean logic denominated computing has been stepwise and predictable because the underlying mechanism fundamentally hasn't changed. It's just how do you make it faster? How do you make it less cyclical? How do you add more random access? How do you improve performance? And it's all been stepwise engineering process improvements. And we're stepping into something that's just different. Quantum algorithms are different. And that's, I don't think that we can, I think the danger to me is that we paint ourselves into a box of believing that this is just faster regular computing. Right? So the crazy thing you're thinking about, go for it.
Please.
Next slide.
Is this our next slide?
Yeah, it's our next slide.
Oh, okay.
So the secret sauce that David and I figured out is a way to use patents and trade secrets as a way to leverage cash flows to make it possible to hold an investment for 20 years, as opposed to having to have a 7-year hold. And then to package that to our investors in a way so that they look at what we're doing the same way that they look at bonds, as opposed to looking at it like venture capital. So it's a lot safer. It's called securitized, right? And we invest in the creation of intellectual property and new science, as opposed to investing in companies that are going to grow. Not that we don't want that to happen, because that's always a good, I mean, that's our best possible outcome. But our thought processes are denominated around the intellectual property aspect. The other piece is that we understand the academia is just a festering snake that we understand we can keep you from getting debt to a very large extent. And as part of that also, we understand that you as a researcher, scientist, practitioner may not actually want to be doing this commercially, and that your best and highest use may actually be in the lab. And my office mate in grad school and I talk all the time. He's a professor back at Rice University. He does not understand how I do what I do, and I don't understand how he hasn't killed himself yet. But we're just different. We're cut out of different cloth, right? And if you're a true commercial scientist and it's your destiny in life to be the CTO of a hot quantum-based startup, more power to you, and we can help you with that. And if you should stay in the lab, we can help you with that too, because we run a process that we call Venture Studio. And part of that is that team thing. We work with people that have had exits. We work with people that have successfully built companies from nothing with nothing. And we put together around great inventors with great ideas and the ability to create good IP companies. We built the whole thing from zero. Right? And a big chunk of what we do is trying to manage this in a way so that even if the company dies, that the inventor and the value of the invention is preserved. Mm-hmm. So.
And I think it's important to note, I think that nowadays, and we don't have to talk about why, because that's a very boring story about finance and accounting, but that the value of inventors, pure invention and intellectual property just in and of itself is oftentimes devalued by corporations, and as well as venture capital. And we would like to ensure that the inventor, whether you decide to stay in the lab or want to cross over to the business side, is compensated for the thing that they created, and not waived off. So,
Right.
yeah.
So, so there was a great question in the chat that I want
There are a
to
lot
get to
of
on the one on. There's a lot, but I want to go to the one on intellectual ventures, right? So, intellectual ventures, interesting outfit, right? Nathan Myhrvold, former CTO at Microsoft, sets this thing up. Ken Lustig, who started the IP practice at Microsoft to begin with. Ken Lustig, legendary dude, like his first year on the job managing IP for Microsoft, booked $1.2 billion in IP licensing. Incredible, right? So in patents, there are two classes of patent holders. One is called a practicing entity, right? So if I have the patent, and I am then building the thing that the patent teaches, I'm practicing the patent, then I am a practicing entity. So, and a good example of that would be, Apple, that has patents on a variety of different things, and then they build devices that incorporate that. Intel's the same way; they've got a bunch of patents on process and designing and implementing CPU architectures and some architectural elements. And so when you see companies that are manufacturing that also have a large number of patents, those are practicing entities. The other type of company is called a non-practicing entity, or an NPE. And some of those entities are referred to as patent trolls, because they basically live under the bridge and try to extract the toll from you when you try to cross it, but don't add any value to the process. IVP is Institute Intellectual Venture Partners, is an NPE largely, but they also they do a combination of both developing new IP in-house. They've got their own R&D labs, and buying and licensing IP from third parties and then monetizing that. So they've got teardown labs as well, right? So they actually tried to recruit me to run one of the teardown labs back about 2010 or so. And it was an interesting gig, because basically you were just supposed to go off and buy a bunch of crap and take it apart and figure out how it works, and then run through the patent library and figure out if it's infringing against any of the things that you have patents on, and then knock on their door and say, give me money because you're infringing on my patent. There's an active market in buying and selling patents. Richardson Oliver Insights, the company that mainly tracks that, tells me that as of first quarter of 2020, the average price for patents sold in the company-to-company patent transactions about $300,000, and that the number of patents that were transacted is on the order of about 100,000. So it's a fairly active market. Most of it's company-to-company. Some of it is companies selling to non-practicing entities because they've decided they're not going to ever do anything with it, but they might as well make some money off of it by selling it to somebody that knows how to find infringers. There are also defensive aggregators. There's a company called RPX that basically is a membership club. It's a patent club, right? So they acquire patents from a variety of different sources, and then you join their club, and if you join the club, you get a license to the patents, and it costs you less than if you'd gone and bought the patent yourself. So there's a lot of activity that kind of happens in that space. Let's see, from Tom, how do we preserve the value for the inventor if the company goes bankrupt? So you need to understand a couple of things about patents, right? So it costs me on average to get to what's called first office action, from the point that I file a patent till the patent office comes back and says, I don't like your filing, which they always do. That's about $15,000. And to get it from there to the point that the patent's been issued is going to be somewhere between $8,000 and $15,000. It's $20,000 to $30,000 to get a patent issued. And then if you're just a dude with a patent, over the course of time, you're going to get hit with a bill at 4 years, and another one at 8 years, and another at 12 years. It's going to total up to about $15,000. And if you don't pay those toll gates back to the patent office, dissolve your patent. It's called abandonment because you're no longer paying for maintenance. So and the grant's for 20 years. So the notion is that you pay whatever it takes to get the patent issued, because in theory you could do that yourself. On in practice it's so complicated that you need counsel. Once it's issued, then you pay maintenance on it over the course of time, which is basically tax to the government for you owning the patent. So you have to think about it holistically about how do I run this thing for 20 years. So we use a business structure where we on a one-to-one basis, we structure when we're starting a company that we're going to invest in, we start a second company that's a special purpose vehicle that owns the patents. And then we do a global exclusive cross-license agreement where the patents are licensed just to this one operating company for all time, as long as they're being practiced, in exchange for a royalty stream, which is commercial, on a commercial rate. And then that provides enough income to keep that holding company alive to do all the things that it needs to do to process and prosecute the patent. And then, because the patent is now not an asset of the company, the license is an asset of the company. In the event that the company evaporates, fails for some reason or another, the corporate entity that actually holds the patents doesn't. And we roll that back into our patent practice where we continue to pay the maintenance fees and do the enforcement actions and whatnot. And then the ownership of that company is split between our investors, our IP practice group, and the original inventors. So that over the course of time, as that develops income, that the people that are responsible for it existing are compensated for that happening.
There's a very short case study we have on our website about how this looked in the real world for a company called Intertrust. So if you're curious, you can take a look at that, and that sort of lays out the model. And Intertrust was separate than the special purpose entity that held the patents that were Intertrust. And while Intertrust was not cash flow positive, the special purpose entity was highly cash flow positive because they were licensing those to a different vertical that didn't compete with Intertrust. And so they were making licensing revenues.
Right. And so Scott had a question about where patents filed in the TRLs, and the answer is that they can appear anywhere, right? I mean, you can. It's a point of first discovery, right? And so we've done, over the course of time, I've done patents that are like foundational, like, aha, we've discovered this particular math equation that nobody knew existed is a thing and it applies to this. Okay, that's super early. That's like one and a half, right? And then you get things that are further down the line that are like process patents, like there's this thing that people do on a day-to-day basis and it's well known, but if you make this slight change to it, it's this much better, right? And you're not going to ever get there until you're like deep out into 8, 9. So the patent appears at the point at which it appears, and there's not a thing with it. In our practice, and we'll talk about this in a minute, we're mainly looking at the super early stage stuff. But that doesn't mean that we don't have a way to provide support for people that are doing things at later stages as well.
Mm-hmm. Nope, and that was the last slide.
Yep, there you go.
So there was another question that was asked really early about, not about intellectual ventures, but that we get a lot. And where was it? It was Gustavo. Okay. He had 2 questions, I think, that are pretty common. And I think really there's a lot there to discuss. One is it common practice to approach academics with successful research to recruit them? Some companies have their research department working closely with universities, such as IBM. Do venture capital firms look for these opportunities too? I think we should discuss that. Short answer is no, but we have many more things to say. And the second one is, what about the other poll? If you have your idea, but not the technical side knowledge, how to approach the formation of a team in this situation?
Yeah.
So if you have only idea seed, yeah.
Yeah, so we kind of touched on that early on, that it doesn't matter what your domain of expertise is, that you believe that That's the hard part, and everything else is easy. And the reality is that you really have to find a team that comes together. In our world, we're denominated around intellectual property. So a big chunk of what we're looking for is actual things that are intellectual property, which means that if you've got a great idea but you don't have any idea how to build it, that probably isn't center of the fairway for us. I'm not going to say it's a hard no, but it's a big lift.
Mm-hmm.
Back to the recruiting. I mean, so I was a Watson fellow. So IBM TJ Watson really wanted me to wind up. Fran Allen was on my advisory. Son of a. Am I back? Yeah, there we go. Fran Allen was on my advisory team. Really wanted me at Watson, and I declined. I wasn't interested. That wasn't where I wanted to go. That's been a thing for a really long time. There are a lot of companies that both scout, back to my thing on publications, right? If you're writing papers and they're kind of interesting, there are definitely people that are paying attention to that stuff. And you may or may not get unsolicited calls out of the blue saying, say, we're working on this and would wonder if you'd like to take a look at that. Or sometimes you get the more subtle one. We read your paper about X and would wonder if you'd like to come give a talk, right? Well, if that happens, that's a job interview. You just don't know it yet. So, but we don't really have a whole lot of people. So if you Google Venture Studio, you'll find that they're in the last 5-6 years or so. There've been a number of people that have tried to start these up, and the challenge is that most of those are really consumer product focused or software as a service focused, or something that's in the domain of expertise of the people that are operating the studio. And it's the same idea as what we're doing, but we're focused on the science side. And frankly, I read a lot of papers and I talk to a lot of people that have got interesting grad students doing interesting stuff for them, and I have an eye to what's out there in some of the spaces that we're interested in. We're only focused really on 6 spaces. We're looking at AI and machine learning, and including natural language processing, energy, secure networks and systems, quantum,
Life sciences.
healthcare and life sciences and biotech, and then what's the 5th one? I never can remember. The 6th one.
Robotics.
Something I'm obviously not very into. Robotics. Yeah, there we go. Particularly is something I'm not very interested in.
Robots.
Okay. So so we're not trying to
It's my lucky
we're not
robot.
trying to boil the ocean. We're really focused in a limited number of areas. We're looking for things that my view is we're looking for foundational intellectual property stuff that's going to be the bedrock on which a bunch of other stuff gets built. And we're looking for generational impact. We're looking for something that's going to not just be cool today, but it's going to really be used for 20 years, right?
Yeah.
And
I think the world really actually needs, unlike Flappy Bird in VR for food.
Unlike Flappy Bird. Right. Exactly.
So, photonics, no, I don't believe we would. I think that's too much hardware.
Photonics is maybe not for the most part. That's a little too close to practical physics for the stuff we're doing. If the specific, so this thing I'm looking at right now, that's really, it started off looking at like photonics, but it's really metrology, which is a manufacturing defect calculation system, which applies to robotics. So it's kind of thinly threaded back through to robotics. But and I spent a lot of time doing photonic systems, obviously, broadband network technology. I was heavily involved in wave division multiplexing and dense wave division multiplexing, and more ways that you can get gigabits to dance on the head of a needle. But so it's not like it's uninteresting. It's just that it's not one of the areas that we're terrifically interested in, unless it applies to one of the other things. If there's an angle, then we should probably talk about it. And even if there isn't,
company that's it's a chemical compound, and we're not interested in that stuff, but it's specific to robotic surgery, and that makes it a little more in our focus area. Is there anything we should circle back on, or any other questions that anybody might have about anything?
Oh, yeah, a few questions about how to contact you.
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah, because there was someone who had a question about the quantum networks as a landscape and a few other things. Yeah, if you'd like to contact me, you can contact me at my email. My name is just Genevieve at Aventurine. Please don't spam me.
Did we have a slide? Jen, do we have one slide back from there that's got our areas that we're interested in quantum?
I don't know. We put that in there.
Yeah, there we go.
Oh, I skipped this. Sorry.
Not a problem. So while building new processors is cool, that's like way out of our bailiwick. That's something that's like ridiculously expensive. So we're looking for stuff that's basically the sort of thing that you can do with two guys in a lab, right? So my viewpoint on this is that the really interesting stuff is going to be on software and the ways that we rethink algorithms, and then the tools that we need in order to be able to make that more doable rather than less, right? And so quantum networking kind of falls into that, because there's a lot around interconnect paradigms and interconnect technologies that starts to get kind of interesting, particularly as you're trying to start to scale, multiple qubits of processors together in different architectures and what that looks like. And then the networks, there's a talk, 2 weeks ago, about dynamically resizing networks based on the algorithm. I thought was super fascinating, right? So that's a kind of thing that gets some attention. And we're also thinking about this or at least I'm thinking about this in kind of the sub 50 qubit range, because that's we're at a point where the next step is probably going to be 200. And that basically means that 50 is going to be the sort of thing that you can probably find in smaller labs. And there's probably still a huge amount of interesting stuff you can do with that. There's back in the 80s, one of the observations we had is that the Russians were turning out so much better computer science theory than we were, because their hardware was impossibly shitty. And the same thing can apply to this too. If I have less able hardware, then I may have better algorithms.
Super. So are there any other final questions? Good. Thank you both so much. That was fantastic. And so much of it rang true, both from my own experience and the anecdotes I've heard from other people. And,
Well,
and again,
so
I recorded
much.
this and I'll put it on YouTube tonight.
I hope everybody learned something.
Yeah. And
yes.
we're happy to help. I'm pretty easy to find. I'm Stan at aventurine.com, and you can probably find me on LinkedIn, and you
You better be
find me
careful
on
on
Quora.
YouTube, Stan. We're going to get lots of bots.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. So, thank you so much for having us, Mark. This is a pleasure, and hopefully this has been useful for the attendees and for the people that didn't attend and see it later.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone, and see you again in 2 weeks.
Thank
All right.
you.
Take care.
Bye.